corn, agricultural product coming into America, and our farmers starting on April 2nd. It may be a little bit of an adjustment period.
When President Donald Trump began imposing high tariffs on imported goods, he did so with the stated aim of protecting American producers from what he viewed as unfair competition. What started in early 2018 as duties on steel and aluminum quickly morphed into a broader assault on imports from major trading partners, most notably China. As the administration raised the stakes in a trade war, it became clear that the agricultural sector would become an unintended but unavoidable battleground. Farm families resting on razor-thin margins found themselves at the mercy of global tit-for-tat measures that upended decades of agricultural trade patterns, thrusting rural communities into the spotlight and exposing the vulnerabilities inherent in a system built on cross-border supply chains and export markets. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. During the spring of 2018, tariffs first targeted goods like solar panels and residential washers, but soon expanded to metals and a sweeping 25% tariff on a catalog of Chinese imports. In response, China slapped punitive duties on 94 lines of U.S. agricultural goods, including staples such as pork, fruit, and tree nuts. By July, that retaliation had ballooned to 697 different products, and by September 2019, more than 1,000 agricultural categories carried tariffs as steep as 80 to 100%. The sudden imposition of such high levies meant that products once competitively priced in Chinese markets became prohibitively expensive overnight, cutting off vital demand and triggering an immediate drop in export volumes. According to USDA data, the Midwest bore the brunt of these losses. In 2018 alone, Iowa farmers lost an estimated $1.46 billion in revenue, while Illinois producers saw $1.41 billion evaporate, and Kansas growers suffered $955 million in diminished receipts. Beyond the cold arithmetic of lost dollars, rural communities felt the sting in every handshake and kitchen table conversation. Generations of family farms confronted the frightening reality that global politics, decided hundreds or thousands of miles away, could determine whether their crops found buyers or rotted in silos. Markets responded to the tariffs with a classic price wedge effect. Buyers paid more, while sellers received less, an economic inefficiency that economists warn will leave both sides worse off. Farm gate prices for commodities like soybeans and corn became erratic, swinging by dollars per bushel as traders tried to anticipate policy shifts rather than fundamentals of supply and demand. At the same time, tariffs on steel and aluminum drove up the cost of farm equipment and storage facilities, squeezing margins even further. The net result was a double hit: diminished revenues on the one hand and rising input costs on the other, forcing many operations to borrow more just to plant the next season's crop. Recognizing the crisis, the USDA introduced the Market Facilitation Program (MFP), channeling $23 billion in direct payments to farmers between 2018 and 2020. In 2019 alone, $14.4 billion was distributed across roughly 644,000 farming operations, with the average payment amounting to $22,312. Specialty crop producers, growers of fruits, nuts, and vegetables, received 90% of those funds, underscoring how vulnerable perishable and high-value products had become to abrupt market disruptions. While the MFP provided a crucial lifeline, critics argued that its one-time payouts masked deeper structural challenges and disproportionately benefited larger farms that had greater acreage to claim payments against. Complementing direct payments, the Food Purchase and Distribution Program saw the USDA buy about $2.3 billion worth of surplus commodities, pork, dairy, apples, and other goods, to redistribute through food banks and nutrition programs. A separate agricultural trade promotion program dedicated $200 million to help exporters identify new overseas markets. Although these initiatives sought to soften the blow, bureaucratic delays and logistical hurdles often lagged months behind the actual economic pinch, leaving producers wondering whether Washington could move as swiftly as global markets. Soybean growers felt the tariffs' impact in sharply personal terms. China, which had purchased nearly two-thirds of U.S. soybean exports prior to the trade war, canceled over 97% of its orders in a single week after imposing a 125% retaliatory duty. Plantations in states like Arkansas and Missouri saw their contracts vanish, forcing many to store bins half empty or sell on domestic markets flooded with surplus beans. Meanwhile, South American competitors, particularly Brazil, filled the void, cultivating relationships that may outlast the trade war and permanently reroute global supply chains. Pork producers, too, suffered a brutal squeeze. China's retaliatory tariff on American pork deliveries hovered around 125%, effectively pricing U.S. bacon, ham, and fresh cuts out of their most lucrative export market. Within days, orders totaling 12,000 tons were canceled, stranding shipments on docks and leaving processors scrambling to place product domestically, where demand could not absorb the sudden glut. Hog farmers, already contending with rising feed costs, watched their margins evaporate, and many were left culling herds or delaying breeding decisions in hopes of market stabilization. Dairy farmers experienced a similar cascade of challenges. Tariffs from key markets led to an oversupply of milk solids and butterfat at home, driving down farm gate milk prices to near break-even levels. Some cooperatives were forced to shut plants or cut back processing hours, while small dairies, least able to negotiate favorable contracts, faced outright closures. The domino effect rippled into rural economies. Equipment suppliers, feed mills, and even local grocery stores saw sales weaken as the dairy sector retrenched. High-value fruit and nut growers found themselves navigating an ever more treacherous landscape. Apples, cherries, almonds, and walnuts destined for Asian markets incited escalating tariff hikes, and producers scrambled to reroute shipments to Europe, the Middle East, or Central America. This reorientation came with added costs. Longer shipping routes, new marketing strategies, altered packaging standards, and still left many farms saddled with excess inventory. Domestic purchases could not absorb the influx without depressing prices, imperiling the bottom lines of orchards that had invested heavily in mechanization and orchard renewal projects just before the trade war erupted. The politics of perishables were nowhere more visible than in Florida's tomato sector. In late April, the administration announced a 17.09% tariff on Mexican greenhouse tomatoes beginning in mid-July 2025, terminating a decades-old agreement that had balanced supply across seasons. Florida growers hailed the decision as a long-overdue leveling of the playing field against subsidized Mexican producers. But critics warned of higher prices and reduced variety for American consumers. Retailers and restaurants casting their menus for late summer found costs climbing unpredictably, and food service operators lamented the loss of sweet, vine-ripened greenhouse tomatoes that domestic growers have struggled to match. California's vast and diverse agricultural economy did not escape the turmoil. Vineyards that depended on exports to the European Union faced the specter of retaliatory tariffs on wine bottles, glass-making equipment, and even cooperative supplies. Citrus growers in the Central Valley fretted over potential duties on oranges and lemons, while almond exporters saw bids from North Africa and the Middle East slip as global buyers hesitated. Port facilities in Los Angeles and Long Beach reported container backlogs as cargo owners weighed whether to ship at tariff-induced risk or stall inventory to see if policy reversed. Small and medium-scale farmers already grappling with extreme weather events, and in some cases deep federal cuts to climate and conservation programs, described the cumulative effect as a shock to the system. Flooding in the Corn Belt, drought in the Southwest, and wildfires in the West had already strained their balance sheets. Now, with export markets capriciously opened and closed by political calculation, many pressed Washington for another bailout. The calls grew louder across farm bureaus and agrarian lobby groups, who argued that without sustained support, countless family farms would simply disappear. Rural communities once uniformly rallying behind the president found themselves starkly divided. In Iowa, a state that handed Donald Trump decisive support, town halls turned tense as farmers voiced anger greater than the applause he once enjoyed. Heated exchanges with representatives underscored a growing schism. Some steadfastly defended the tariffs as necessary leverage, while others felt betrayed by broken promises and dwindling profitability. Even within families, generational divides deepened as a newer generation of agribusiness graduates challenged the older guard's faith in protectionism. Beyond immediate relief efforts, many operators began rethinking their business models. Farm consolidation accelerated as smaller outfits sold to large corporate entities, better able to absorb price shocks and navigate export regulations. Conversely, a contingent of producers turned to direct-to-consumer sales, ag tourism, and value-added processing to hedge against international market volatility. Agricultural technology firms seized the moment, pitching precision farming tools and climate-resilient seed varieties as bulwarks against whatever tariff wave might come next. The interplay between tariffs and climate extremes also gained attention. Conservation programs that aided soil health and water management were slashed even as flooding and drought intensified, eroding resilience just when farmers needed it most. Experts warned that neglecting sustainable practices would leave American agriculture more fragile against the twin threats of policy whiplash and a changing climate, with soil erosion and water scarcity compounding economic pressures. Global buyers adapting to U.S. policy unpredictability diversified their sources. Mexico expanded its foothold in greenhouse produce, South American soybean exporters deepened ties with China, and European fruit suppliers sought new distribution channels in Asia. In response, U.S. producers explored emerging markets in India, Southeast Asia, and Africa, attending trade missions and negotiating supply agreements that might outlast the current administration's tenure. For American consumers, the cost of these tariffs arrived at the supermarket checkout. The Congressional Budget Office projected that average households would pay approximately $2,700 more annually due to higher tariffs on a wide range of goods, a burden felt most acutely by families already struggling with inflation. In regions dependent on farm employment, the economic ripple extended to equipment dealers, feed suppliers, and even school cafeterias facing budget shortfalls as local tax revenues dipped. Politically, the agricultural belt's frustration fed into larger debates over protectionism versus free trade. Rural voters, once a reliable pillar of support for Trump's messaging, increasingly weighed tangible farm income losses against campaign rhetoric. State and local elections began to reflect this shift, with some traditionally red counties reporting tighter margins and increased support for candidates promising a return to more stable trade agreements. Looking ahead, farmers and policymakers alike recognize the need for a more balanced approach. While leverage remains an essential tool in negotiating fairer trade terms, experience has shown that indiscriminate tariffs can inflict collateral damage on those they were meant to protect. Bolstering market diversification, investing in resilient infrastructure, and maintaining strategic reserve programs are emerging as key priorities to shield American agriculture from future policy shocks. As this chapter of the trade war closes, its lessons about the perils of abrupt economic interventions are already reshaping how rural America plans for an uncertain world. The United States agricultural sector has long been intertwined with global markets, with export demand driving investment in large-scale row cropping and commodity production. Before the imposition of tariffs under the Trump administration, roughly one-fifth of U.S. farm output was destined for overseas buyers, a reliance born of decades of trade liberalization and marketing agreements. This export orientation spurred specialization. The Corn Belt focused on maize and soybeans, California on high-value fruits and nuts, and the Southeast on cotton and rice. Yet this same global integration left American agriculture highly sensitive to retaliatory duties, a vulnerability that became starkly evident when foreign governments responded in kind to U.S. tariff measures. The Phase 1 trade deal signed in January 2020 promised a thaw in farmer anxieties, obligating China to purchase at least $40 billion of U.S. agricultural goods in each of 2 consecutive years. In reality, commitments fell short. Actual purchases amounted to $59.5 billion across 2020-2021, barely covering 73% of the first-year target despite aggressive marketing by U.S. exporters. While beef, pork, and dairy usefully padded those totals, soybeans lagged, highlighting buyers' caution on longer-term contracts. The shortfall underscored how fragile recovery can be when built on politically driven pledges rather than binding trade rules. Beyond the headline commodities of corn, soy, and pork, smaller but economically vital crops also felt the squeeze. U.S. cranberry growers, concentrated in Wisconsin and Massachusetts, watched Chinese tariffs of up to 80% undermine inroads made since 2015. Similarly, blueberry and sweet potato producers, who had diversified into Asian and Middle Eastern markets, found their hard-won customer bases evaporating overnight. The logistical costs of rerouting perishables to new destinations, longer transit times, modified refrigeration protocols, and unfamiliar phytosanitary requirements further eroded profit margins for these specialty sectors. Cotton farmers in Texas, Georgia, and Mississippi, already wrestling with global oversupply, confronted fresh challenges when China reinstituted duties of 25 to 40% on U.S. lint. This came as the domestic textile industry faced rising input costs due to steel and aluminum tariffs, compounding a double whammy. African and Indian cotton exporters seized the vacuum, cementing relationships with Chinese mills that could take years to unwind. As global demand shifted, U.S. cotton futures languished near multi-year lows, impeding planting decisions for the next season. Tariffs on imported fertilizer components, most notably potash from Canada, added an unexpected twist. While U.S. authorities sought to pressure Ottawa over timber and steel, they inadvertently drove up fertilizer prices by 15 to 20%. Corn and soybean growers, whose profitability hinges on judicious nutrient management, saw input costs swell at planting time. Many risk-averse farmers deferred variable rate applications or cut phosphate usage, betting that soil fertility reserves would suffice, but agronomists cautioned that such retrenchment could degrade yields over the medium term. The ethanol sector, which consumes over 40% of the nation's corn crop, found itself in a bind as gasoline demand rebounded post-pandemic. Tariffs on imported automotive parts inflated costs for ethanol plant maintenance, while shifting trade terms with Mexico and Canada under the USMCA complicated biofuel blendstock exports. Plants operating on thin margins delayed capital improvements or idled capacity, depressing demand for corn and rippling back to the farm gate. The tightened ethanol market illustrated how tariff policies extend their reach across complex supply chains. Farm credit became another flashpoint. Rural banks and farm credit system lenders, seeing skyrocketing loan applications and deferred payments, adjusted underwriting standards upwards. Higher interest rates and more stringent collateral requirements began to squeeze smaller producers seeking operating capital. The risk premium on line of credit instruments climbed, reflecting lenders' anticipation of continued market volatility. In many states, the percentage of loans classified as high risk nudged upward by several points, a barometer of the financial strain rippling through agricultural communities. Insurance mechanisms intended to shield farmers from weather and price risks also shifted in 2021 and 2022. Premium subsidies were recalibrated to reflect higher equipment costs and seed investments, inadvertently increasing out-of-pocket exposure for those hit hardest by tariffs. Crop insurance indemnity payments, once a straightforward safety net, became entangled with debates over prevented planting claims, as farmers argued that trade turmoil qualified as a hindrance beyond mere weather. Policy adjustments proved slow to materialize, fueling frustration that federal risk-sharing programs were ill-suited to policy-driven shocks. The human toll of sustained economic stress in rural America cannot be overstated. Mental health experts reported a surge in anxiety and depression among farmers grappling with plunging revenues and uncertain futures. While suicide rates among agricultural workers had already trended above national averages, community organizations noted a rise in crisis hotline calls and local support group meetings. The combination of social isolation, financial pressure, and limited access to mental health care created what one researcher termed a silent epidemic in the heartland. Land values, historically buoyed by robust commodity prices and low interest rates, began to plateau and even decline in high export regions. Counties in eastern Nebraska and central Illinois, once commanding record rental rates for fertile fields, reported reductions of 5 to 10% in lease agreements. Farmland auctions attracted fewer bidders, and some owners opted to lease land at lower rates rather than risk no takers. This correction, while easing entry points for younger farmers, also eroded land equity for long-established families reliant on real estate holdings for retirement security. Public funding for agricultural research and extension services came under scrutiny as Congress debated broader budgetary recalibrations. Hatch Act and Smith-Lever Act appropriations, which underpin university research and county-level outreach, remained essentially flat, forcing states and private donors to fill gaps. Experiments on tariff-resilient crop varieties and alternative cropping systems were delayed or downsized. At a time when innovation could offer pathways out of dependency on a narrow slate of exports, the policy environment left research agendas equally constrained. Labor dynamics in agriculture, heavily reliant on seasonal H-2A workers, experienced additional turbulence. Visa processing delays, exacerbated by heightened scrutiny of immigration, and shifting tariff-induced planting schedules created mismatches between labor supply and harvest windows. Growers of labor-intensive crops such as fruits, vegetables, and tobacco scrambled to secure workforce permits, often at higher prevailing wages, which in turn pushed up production costs. Some operations scaled back plantings of high labor crops in favor of mechanizable alternatives, reshaping crop mixes in states like North Carolina and Washington. Logistical choke points amplified the impact of trade disruptions. River barge shipments of grain from the upper Mississippi to Gulf ports were delayed by maintenance backlogs, exacerbated when steel tariffs constrained lock and dam repairs, forcing farmers to store crops longer or accept lower rail rates. Port congestion at Savannah and Houston worsened as shippers delayed containers in hope of tariff relief, squeezing space for agricultural exports. Each additional day in transit translated to higher freight and storage fees, a cost farmers ultimately bore. Investment in agritech startups soared as venture capitalists sought to back companies promising resilience against policy shocks. Firms specializing in on-farm grain storage sensors, blockchain-based supply chain tracking, and autonomous machinery reported record funding rounds. While this surge of capital signified confidence in the sector's long-term prospects, it also drew criticism for favoring scalable tech solutions over urgent cash flow needs in distressed farming communities. The wave of innovation, though promising, risked leaving behind producers too small or cash-strapped to adopt expensive new tools. In response to market turbulence, agricultural cooperatives accelerated consolidation and vertical integration. Regional grain co-ops merged to share shipping and marketing infrastructure, negotiating better freight contracts. Dairy and pork cooperatives invested in processing facilities abroad to circumvent retaliatory duties, effectively relocating portions of the value chain. While these strategies aim to stabilize member returns, they also fueled debate over the future of cooperative governance and the balance between local control and global competitiveness. At the grassroots level, farmers embraced direct-to-consumer models with renewed vigor. Community-supported agriculture subscriptions grew by over 15% in 2023 as local producers leveraged social media campaigns and mobile markets to bypass disrupted export channels. Artisan flour mills, microbreweries sourcing barley, and farm-to-table restaurants formed tight networks, keeping a higher share of the food dollar within regional economies. Though small in scale compared to commodity exports, these ventures delivered tangible returns and strengthened community ties. Trade associations, such as the American Soybean Association and National Cattlemen's Beef Association, upped their lobbying efforts, filing WTO complaints against China's heightened duties and petitioning Congress for expedited relief programs. Legal challenges to Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs made their way through federal courts, arguing that the administration overstepped statutory authority. These judicial battles highlighted the tension between executive trade actions and legislative oversight, with rulings potentially reshaping the toolkit available for future trade policy. State governments, particularly in farm-heavy regions, adopted bespoke measures to shore up producers. Nebraska introduced a zero-interest loan program for grain storage expansions. Michigan offered tax credits to fruit growers diversifying into value-added products, and Texas passed a resilience grant for cotton and sorghum rotational planting. While these initiatives offered targeted relief, they also underscored the fragmentary nature of support, varying widely in scope and accessibility from state to state. Environmental conservation programs, once champions of regenerative agriculture, faced funding caps as lawmakers redirected resources toward immediate trade mitigation. The Conservation Reserve Program acreage under contract dipped slightly as budgetary pressures mounted, and cost-share assistance for cover crops was cut by 10% in 2022. Critics warned that scaling back these programs risked long-term soil health and water quality, leaving producers more exposed to both climate extremes and policy volatility. In parallel, climate-smart agriculture adoption, precision irrigation, variable rate fertilization, and drought-tolerant seed varieties grew unevenly. Farms with capital to invest saw yield improvements and input efficiencies, while cash-constrained operations delayed or skipped upgrades. This technological divide mirrored the broader financial bifurcation in rural America, raising questions about equitable access to innovations that might buffer against future trade and environmental shocks. With China's market behaving unpredictably, American exporters scouted emerging destinations. India, with its growing poultry and dairy demand, featured prominently in USDA-led trade missions. Southeast Asia's middle classes offered opportunities for tree nuts and dried fruits, while African markets, particularly Kenya and Nigeria, showed interest in U.S. wheat and corn. These nascent relationships, though smaller in volume, promised diversification that could blunt the impact of any single partner's retaliatory action. Consumers felt the effects of agricultural tariffs at the grocery store as well. Retail chains reported price increases of 5 to 8% on items like pork chops and chicken breasts in 2022, attributing the hikes partly to higher farm input costs and reduced supply chain efficiencies. Restaurants, squeezing margins further, revised menus or raised entree prices, passing some of the burden on to diners and slowing growth in the food service sector. Politically, the narrative of the trade war reverberated through agricultural belt elections. In Iowa's 2024 Senate primary, candidates' positions on tariffs became litmus tests for rural voters, contributing to upsets of incumbents seen as out of touch. Extension agents reported that town hall meetings increasingly centered on trade policy rather than farm subsidies or environmental regulation. This shift highlighted the electorate's growing insistence that trade agreements deliver concrete benefits, not just diplomatic leverage. The collective experience of tariff-induced upheaval has generated a set of lessons for policymakers and producers alike. First, reliance on a narrow set of export markets can leave entire regions vulnerable to policy swings. Second, rapid response programs, whether trade mitigation payments or logistical support, must be designed with flexibility and minimal red tape. Third, strengthening domestic supply chains, from input production to processing facilities, can provide buffers when international trade falters. As the next chapter in U.S. trade policy unfolds, many observers are calling for a more calibrated approach. Targeted duties, oriented towards specific unfair practices rather than blanket tariffs, may offer leverage with fewer side effects. Binding dispute settlement through the WTO and bilateral frameworks can help prevent retaliatory spirals. Moreover, embedding robust adjustment assistance for affected industries, including mental health services, retraining programs, and community investment, could mitigate the human and economic costs of future trade skirmishes. North American agricultural integration faced a startling test when steel and aluminum tariffs were extended to Canada and Mexico, triggering reciprocal duties on non-USMCA compliant foodstuffs. Though the USMCA maintained zero tariffs for goods meeting strict origin rules, any shipment falling outside those parameters, a trailer of fresh tomatoes, a load of Canadian potash, or bin-run grain, suddenly faced a 25% levy, while energy and fertilizer imports could see 10% duties. These measures rattled a supply chain that long relied on seamless cross-border flows, complicating everything from dairy and poultry shipments to seed and agronomic inputs that cross provincial and state lines multiple times before reaching fields. The 2018 Farm Bill's cornerstone safety net programs, Agriculture Risk Coverage ARC, and Price Loss Coverage PLC, proved ill-suited to absorb the shocks of abrupt tariff reprisals. Though congressional ad hoc market facilitation program payments exceeded $23 billion, auditors found these bailouts bypassed payment limit rules and often overlapped without aligning to actual revenue shortfall. One Wisconsin grower reported the cost to treat his soybean seed jumping from $12,810 to $26,132. The result was a cascade of higher prices for herbicide, fungicide, and specialty seed blends, forcing tighter margins before the first crop even made it into the ground. As family farms weighed consolidation, institutional investors and REITs moved in, seizing nearly 1 million acres of U.S. cropland over the past 3 years. According to the National Council of Real Estate Investment Fiduciaries, overall agricultural land investment doubled to $16.6 billion by 2024, even as farmland partners and similar corporations focused on deleveraging balance sheets, reducing net debt by nearly 45% in late 2024, to shore up dividends for shareholders. This influx of capital reshaped farmland ownership. raising debates over affordability and long-term stewardship. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Trump's tariffs' impact on farmers? What outcomes do you expect? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.